Let's look at some examples of how monetary policy can actually affect the economy. If we have our aggregate demand curve, an aggregate supply curve in terms of price and output, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and aggregate demand decreased as a result of, say, a decrease in consumption this time. If aggregate demand decreased, you'd want to increase the amount of aggregate demand. You can do this through monetary policy by somehow increasing the money supply. Interest rates, quantity of money, downward sloping demand of money, vertical money supply. Money demand, money supply. So that would be the quantity supplied of money. You could increase the money supply. You could do this by OMOs or reserve ratios or repo rates. Try and remember how those change and how those can change the money supply. You could increase the money supply, which would therefore lower the interest rate. If you lower the interest rate, you can increase investment and increase interest-sensitive consumption, and so you can shift the aggregate demand curve back. This is the analysis that you would need to do in terms of monetary policy and how it affects output and prices in this aggregate demand, aggregate supply schedule. So let's have a quick look at the South African aspect of monetary policy. Well, it's usually controlled by Tito Mboweni and the Reserve Bank. They have one main goal. They're mandated to try and get inflation targeting. So the inflation must be between 3% and 6%. I spoke briefly about this earlier, but let's just go through it again. So inflation, CPIX, which is Consumer Price Index minus excluding mortgage payments, must be between 3% and 6%. That's what they're mandated to do. Now, how can they get it between 3% and 6%? The main way they do that is through the repo rate. They can increase the repo rate when they expect inflation is going too high, and they can decrease the repo rate when they expect inflation to be too low. So if you're looking at inflation in terms of time and inflation, this is the band, let's say. This is 6%, that's 3%. They are trying to get inflation to be within this band. It used to be very high in South Africa, and then they got it below, and they've kept it in, and they've got it here. What do you think the reactions were at each stage? At a point such as this, they were increasing the repo rate. When they increase the repo rate, that decreases investment and decreases consumption, shifts this curve downwards, and decreases the price. So as you can see, by increasing the repo rate, they can shift this AD curve downwards and decrease the price. Note, however, that it's not a decrease in price, it's a decrease in the increase in price. So the prices are now going to be increasing at a slower rate. That's what the increase in the repo rate does. You don't want a decrease in price, you don't want deflation. All you want is for the increase in price to fall between this band, and to get it to come down, they will increase interest rates. Then when it stays in the band and they expect, say, oil shocks, let's say there were oil shocks, or there was too much consumption, excess consumption, too much consumer demand, these factors would push the inflation rate upwards, because if there's demand pull inflation, too much consumer demand, it'll push inflation rate upwards. Or if there's an oil shock that's cost push inflation, it'll push the prices of goods upwards. So if they think that in 6 months' time, these factors are going to push this inflation rate above 6%, they're going to increase the repo rate now. So they increase the repo rate, get inflation rate down, and try and keep it steady. The other policy that the Reserve Bank has, it's actually in the Constitution, is that they have to look after the value of the rand. The Reserve Bank will therefore use those dollars and use those gold reserves to try and keep the rand as stable as possible. They're not going to interfere in the market processes, but they're going to use those reserves so that there aren't any increases in volatility in the value of the rand. So those are the two main requirements of the Reserve Bank. They also look after the required reserve ratio of banks, and they check that the banking sector is in order and there's no another Sambo effect in the economy, which would be disastrous for the economy. But the main important point is to try and keep this inflation within 3% and 6%. At the moment, we're tending up to the upper band, so they've been increasing repo rates, so they're going to try and get that inflation downwards.